Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Jordan. Thank you so much for joining us for our first installment of the SciComm Together event series put on the Department of Communications and Marketing at the Rollins School of Public Health. Today we'll be talking about social media and science misinformation. I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's speakers on our panel. Dr. Natalie Dean is an assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics and Bioinformatics at the Rollins School of Public Health. She became active in communications at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic via Twitter. Her current X follower count is 127,400. During that time, she also began engaging with the press heavily. Her op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Stat News, and Slate. She has over 300 press quotes across national and international outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Good Morning America, and NPR's All Things Considered. Next is Laurel Bristow. She's our Associate Director of Audience Development at the Rollins School of Public Health. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, she used her knowledge of infectious disease, clinical trials, and public health to make educational videos on her Instagram account to answer questions people had about what was going on. Her following reached a peak of 450,000 followers, and she's been interviewed for such publications as Mother Jones, Vice, Harper's Bazaar, and she's been a guest on Science Friday, MTV News, and CNN, among others. Lastly is our moderator for today, Dr. Carmen Marcet. He's our Executive Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research Strategy, Rollins Distinguished Professor of Research, and Professor of Environmental Health and Epidemiology at the Rollins School of Public Health. His research focuses on the impacts of the chemical, physical, and social environment on pregnant people and their offspring. He also serves as director of the Emory Hercules Exposome Research Center and the NIEHS-funded training program in the environmental health sciences and toxicology. He's committed to supporting the education, career development, and mentoring of trainees and faculty. We'll begin today's conversation with a set of predetermined questions, then we'll end with some time for you all to ask questions. I hope you'll all stick around, enjoy some refreshments afterwards, and get to talk some more with our guests today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kelly. Good afternoon, everybody. So I have a couple questions that we'll start with, and then we'll be able to open this up to the audience as well. So to start, and I think we heard a little bit from Kelly about some of your backgrounds and where you came from, but can you tell us a little bit about what was your journey to becoming a social media influencer?
Me?
Sure.
Okay, so my journey definitely is very much linked to the pandemic. I think Laurel's probably going to say something similar. As someone who worked on infectious disease research and emerging infectious diseases before the pandemic, definitely was part of a relatively small community that was sort of plugged in to this stuff. So when the pandemic sort of started to emerge, I was actually on maternity leave, and so with my second child. And I just remember like Twitter as being kind of an easy thing to open up and scroll while my daughter was napping. and I think we were in a situation where information was moving so quickly that we really couldn't keep up just sort of through traditional channels, right? So social media, a lot of people turned to social media at that time. I had like 200 followers. I really was not active on Twitter. I'd not really been, done much on Twitter before. I'd used it to say like, I'm going to this conference, hope to see you there, But I started sharing some content about, clinical trials for infectious diseases, stuff linked to our previous work. I'd attended a conference in Geneva on Middle East respiratory syndrome before and like treatment trials, and I was like, I can share kind of what we learned there and how it applies to this situation. So I was able to link things in, and that gathered some attention. And I think one of the first big moments for me was when a Washington Post reporter reached out to me and wanted me to write an op-ed. And so I wrote an op-ed, and it's actually very much drawn from one of my papers that I had previously written. And another big moment is when I was talking to a reporter from Washington Post about the IHME models, the big models that were circulating at the time for projections, and we sort of arrived at this quote about how do we know when we can get back to normal life? And we said something, it said something like, it's like asking a fireman like when you can move back in, but your house is still on fire. And so he put that in there, and Jake Tapper ended up quoting that, and I was like, whoa, we are not in Kansas anymore. So basically just ended up tweeting out more content, and from that gathered more attention and also more opportunities. And so I went back to work at that time, and so I just, but it stayed as one part of how I engaged during the pandemic, in addition to my research and my, what I was doing with my community, but just having this outward-facing role. So.
Yeah, I worked for Emory for the School of Medicine. I was hired by the Hope Clinic, which is part of the Vaccine and Treatment Evaluation Unit in 2018, and so I was embedded in Midtown Hospital. So when we realized that COVID was in Atlanta and in the hospitals, we kind of shut all of our studies down for a period of time because we were doing respiratory virus research, and I didn't want my team sent into these rooms with people who had respiratory symptoms, but we didn't yet have a COVID test in the hospital. So kind of in the 4 days that we weren't doing anything and trying to figure out what we were doing, I made a story on my private personal Instagram account for friends and family, asking if anyone wanted me to explain what I meant by flattening the curve, what we knew about COVID. This was mid-March of 2020, and people asked for it, so I did it, and then people asked if I would make my Instagram public so that they could tell their friends to watch it, and I said, that's fine. And did that thinking that that would be I'd leave it public for the weekend and then private it again. But I got 500 followers overnight, and then I got 5,000 followers within 72 hours, and people started sending me more questions and, wanting more explanation. And so I think social media, or my presence on social media, really grew because it felt like a more personal relationship, because there, like Natalie said, there was so much information and people really didn't know where to turn. So someone that feels approachable or relatable is really appealing in that time of extreme stress. And so that's kind of how it grew. And so I also had so much credibility because once we started studies again, our studies were on COVID. I was, leading the remdesivir clinical trials to figure out treatments, and doing a lot of population-based, lifetime studies on COVID to try to figure out how it affects the body and why it does what it does. So I was really a frontline worker in the mix, and then also talking to people on the internet. So I think that led to a lot of trust in the public, and it just kept growing from there.
So it sounds like neither of you really set out to be influencers, but it kind of happened. So were you surprised that it happened?
Yeah. I think I personally was surprised that it happened so fast and to such a huge degree, because my personal Instagram was very personal. It was so separate from work. And I didn't even follow any other scientists kind of at the time, or people who were doing science communication. And I started building that network because it was really helpful, and science communication is such a team sport. But it can cause a lot of introspection for me about what about me worked really well for people, because other people who had been doing this for longer or had wanted to do this weren't seeing the kind of insane rise in numbers that I was. So it was incredibly surprising for me. I mean, I knew people were hungry for information, but what about, my brand of education worked for people is something that I have spent a ton of time thinking about.
Yeah, building off of that, I mean, I think it appealed to my my interest in teaching, and why I enjoyed teaching and explaining things and making information more accessible. I find it's challenging, and it requires a different skill set to be able to explain kind of complex topics in a clear and concise way. And so that appealed to me, and that sort of ability also to contribute to understanding of a difficult and confusing, complex situation. So just that ability to help people sort of digest what was going on, that appealed to me too. And I think that is something, it allowed me to demonstrate those skills too.
So Laura, you focused on Instagram, and Natalie, you focused more on Twitter, X. Why? What made you want to go to those platforms and not others? Or
For me, I think mine was just kind of accidental. Like, that is what I used the most. I had a Twitter account forever, but I didn't really post very actively on there. And I consider myself very lucky that the medium that I happened into was my Instagram stories, because, you know, it's not inherently shareable with anyone. Like, you can't repost somebody's post and everything. But the benefits I found out from that are that everyone responds in DM. So there is no like public forum for people who are anti-vax or like trying, you know, conspiracy theorists. There's no one that their messages just go to me and only I see them, which I think is actually like super beneficial, because then you don't have to deal with people fighting in your replies. And I think just that medium worked for me because part of the appeal is like my personality. Like, it's weird, but to be on the receiving end of a parasocial relationship because of science information, but it is what happened because people liked me or the me that I present on social media, right? And so that ended up working out for me. And I specifically remember like not really having any interest in getting involved in what was happening on Twitter. I used Twitter as like to me, it was much more an academic space for academics to, you know, teach. Like I followed Natalie for a super long time. And I remember when she said she was coming to Emory and I was really excited. But yeah, that was like where I went, you know, before it got bought by Elon Musk and everything kind of changed. But that was like, for me, the hub of like real academics to like be able to hear what their opinions and their thoughts and breakdowns of things were. So Instagram felt good to me because it felt like a place where I felt the most qualified to be, because it was maybe more like, I don't know, personality based than strictly like science.
Yeah, that align. I mean, that's sort of my feeling too, and that's why I wanted to be on Twitter. I mean, one thing was, you know, that's where my colleagues were, and that's where I was getting the information was coming in. But then also the audience that I view myself as most interested in talking to is kind of adjacent to where, you know, there's like an insular community of folks who work in infectious disease epi. I viewed myself as talking to smart people in like adjacent fields. Like I would always picture, I don't know, someone like English. Yes, right. Like, you know, the people who wanted to understand the dynamics, people who wanted to understand the details, but just didn't necessarily speak the same language I did. And also reporters. There are a lot of reporters on Twitter. So that was, ended up being a useful way to connect with them, and they, you know, would sometimes use tweets as content as well and things like that.
And so kind of, I think building off of that comment, I mean, you talked a little bit about how yours was sort of discovered and took off. So I guess, how did you prepare then to see more of that, right? And how did you prepare when you were asked to now speak on national media? What kind of things did you think about in order to do that?
I was terrified. I mean, I feel like I just sort of, I don't know, just jumped in, and I relied a lot on my friends. I remember pretty early on being asked to go on CNN, and I was like, well, me on CNN? This is so unimaginable. And I found out I didn't really like going on TV. I found it very stressful, but I did it. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I did it. So I think it was just such a crazy time, and so many weird things were happening. It's like, well, here's this other weird thing that I'm doing things I didn't expect to be doing. But so I didn't prepare at all. I felt very unprepared at times, but I just blindly went ahead.
Yeah, I think, yeah, a lot of I didn't prepare at all, or, I mean, for me, because like I have a master's of science, I don't have a PhD. I'm not like a specialized academic. The imposter syndrome risk was very real. So I leaned really heavily on, you know, my network. I was lucky that I worked at the School of Medicine and had so many people in so many different fields of like virology and epidemiology and infectious disease and respiratory disease and ICU doctors. And everyone was very collaborative and willing, because there are so many people who are so smart, but they have no interest in like communicating with the public. And so they are available to me as someone that they know and a colleague that they work with, so that I can ask questions. So I think I leaned super heavily on that kind of stuff to be able to say, like, look, I am not an expert, but I have access to a network of experts, so I am going to talk to them. You know, you get these questions sometimes, and it was, I think, a big thing for people to learn and for me to learn too, to say, like, that's a great question. I don't feel comfortable answering it, but I can come back to you in like 48 hours when I have some time to talk to someone who can then give me an answer that I can share with you.
That's great. And do you feel more comfortable now?
Yes and no. I mean, there are still things. I think it also is like, now that I'm not doing clinical, like I had so much street cred because I was doing clinical research at the hospital, and now I feel, I worry about feeling detached from it because I am doing full-time science communication, but I still have that network. I still have my like basis of understanding, and I think the thing I feel more confident in now is my ability to, you know, fact check my sources and make sure that I'm getting stuff, and to know that it's okay for me to ask people when I need clarification, and to reach out to experts to ask them questions just to make sure that I am presenting everything as correctly as possible.
How about you, Nick?
Yeah, I feel more confident in some ways. I've also learned a lot about myself and what I feel comfortable doing. I've definitely learned that I would never have described communication as one of my skills before this. But now I'm like, okay, I feel pretty comfortable doing this, and I feel much more comfortable in front of audiences. I feel like giving big talks and things like that. So there's some things that have definitely shifted. I still don't want to go on TV, but I feel better at preparing answers for questions and kind of knowing what people are looking for. And so there's definitely a lot of things I've learned. Yeah.
That's good. So there's a lot of transferable things that you could take from what you've done, and now you can use it in different ways.
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. Definitely in terms of like understanding the why it matters, which is not something that I think it can be easy to forget. But I've realized that ability to translate the why and explain the why, like there's a lot of things I've learned. Yeah.
So do you have advice that you would give other people if they were thinking about, wanting to become science communication influencers out there?
Yeah, I think my biggest advice was like, people can sense when you're being genuine. Like, you have to really care about what you're doing, because that's like the thing that people are going to latch onto and understand. And just to really think about like what you want your role as a science communicator to be, because I've seen success in people like me who I share a lot of my personality on the internet, which means that there are people who feel very connected to my personal life, which is like kind of weird, but it's something that I've chosen and that I accept. And there are other people who are, strictly very professional in how they communicate information, and like that works for them too. So I think you just, going into things, have to think about how much you want to share of yourself in the ways that you're going to connect with people. There's no right way to do it, but I think the most important way is to pick what's right for you, because people will sense if you're doing something that you don't feel comfortable with or don't feel authentic about.
Yeah, I agree. Like genuine enthusiasm for any topic is very contagious, and I think people are really sensitive to authenticity. Like, they don't want anything that feels too like phony or self-serving. I think if you really care about a topic, and like you're excited about sharing it, you're excited about teaching it. I feel like for folks in an academic space, like sharing your research that you're excited about, and you're excited about other people doing the work in your area as well, and you want to teach people about things. Like, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity. There's just so much going on. It's very hard for people to keep up with things. And so the more folks that we have out there that are helping explain what is happening, the more we all learn and benefit and can use those things. So, focusing on an area that you're into and excited about.
And so if you're trying to help others think about doing this, do you think that there are specific platforms that are really good for this right now, or really the direction to go?
Yeah, I think it just depends on what you want to do. Like, Natalie and I have very different platforms that we thrive on. Some people like to be able to write things out. Some people like to be able to talk and explain things. I think just thinking about, what works for you. Obviously, there are platforms where misinformation is a lot more rampant. And so if you're like super, if that's something that you care deeply about, like being on, like, I had no interest in being on TikTok because I just think it's like out of control. Like, I don't want someone to stitch my videos, and I don't feel like dealing with the comments. So that's something that I've let other people do, and will support their work. But my biggest advice is like, protect yourself first for what you like to do.
I've only been active on one platform. I have a private Instagram. I just post pictures of my kids, and so I don't have experience with other things as like a creator. But I think long form things can be really like blog posts, and I mean, I don't. Twitter's in such a, or X is in such a weird place that who knows exactly what's going to be the best moving forward. I know some people are moving to LinkedIn more, but yeah, I wouldn't say I have particular. It's hard to say, yeah, what's going to be the best, but it does depend on sort of how interactive you want it to be, how much of your personality do you want to convey, how long should it be, like who's the audience. There's a lot. Those are the types of considerations.
And you talked a little bit about some of this. I think, Laurel, you sort of talked about, starting with the private Instagram. So how do you handle sort of the comment that, and Natalie, definitely you've had to deal with a lot of this. So how do you handle those negative comments, those hateful type comments that appear?
At a certain point, I did close my DMs. Like that was one way. For certain things, I wouldn't always check the comments. I use the mute button a lot. I don't really use the block button a lot, but I mute people. I would get weird emails, kind of upsetting emails. That wasn't, and yeah, it happened like when I would go on CNN, or it wasn't so often, but the times that I did, and it would kind of be associated with moments of like particularly high exposure. Like I wrote it two op-eds in the New York Times, and both times there was, repercussions. My advice, I don't know. It was, I just sort of blocked it out. Some were just real crazies. I think what troubled me more is when there was like, when people had real like intellectual disagreement and I didn't want to get things wrong. And like, I think there's some people it's very easy to ignore, and then there's some stuff where like, oh, you're getting this wrong, or you're, I think that was harder for me when I was like, wanted to make sure that I was doing right by my followers and getting the information correct. And that was what would stick in my mind more.
Like my advice is, again, to like protect yourself first. I had some weird complex at the beginning where I was like, I'm not going to block anyone. Everyone deserves access to this information. Like maybe like, no, just block. If people are harassing you, you can block them. It's fine. Like no one is required to have access to you. But yeah, I like when I had a period where I just stopped checking my request folder, my DM request folder on Instagram, like my mental health got exponentially better. It's fine to step away from that. Using limitations like Instagram makes it so that only people who follow you can comment on your posts, because my grid posts are like stuff from my life. None of it's really science related, and people will use that as an opportunity to try to say stuff. So blocking those, that kind of thing. Not reading comments, that stuff's really important. But yeah, I mean, I think I had a benefit. It's if I was on Twitter trying to engage in like academic conversations with people and they were like arguing with the merits of like what I was saying, I think like that would be harder for me. But mine is like on Instagram, you get DMs from people that are like, it's like, what are they going to say? They're like, no, actually mRNA is like 5G microchipping. And you're like, well, that's just wrong. Like, you don't have to feel that bad. That's just like, I'm right and you're wrong. So that made things a little bit easier. But yeah, I mean, just protect yourself first. And if you need to step away from what you're doing, absolutely do that. It's a team sport. That's why it's nice to build a network of people and just be like, hey, this person has already covered this thing. If you guys want to look at what they're doing, that's great. So that you don't have to like constantly be covering everything yourself.
Sure. And that plays into sort of my next question, which is around time management and how you think about that. So how do you balance this with the rest of your life and think about still being able to contribute?
Yeah, I think when I started, like, I don't have any kids. I live alone, and I was in the hospital for like 10 to 12 hours a day, and it was just like very dark in the hospital. And so coming home, having this other thing to do that kept my mind occupied, I honestly, looking back at it, have no idea how I did the volume of like science communication that I was doing while working like 60 hours a week. And it wasn't sustainable. So when things started to calm down, I stepped away and I really tried to be like, all right, I know you guys have gotten used to like posts 3 to 5 times a week, but it's going to be like once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, and just like, managing the expectations. But like I said, no one is required to have access to you. So now in my life, I've very much calmed down, and mostly it's like, if something really big is happening, I will, take time to make my story about it. I'm also very lucky that now my job is to do science communication for Rollins. So it's much easier to just post what I did for work on my Instagram story and be like, oh my God, look at this, it's here already. So yeah, like I said, it's a team sport. So you just want to build a network where you can take time off and you don't feel obligated to keep doing everything by yourself.
Yeah, this is definitely something I've struggled with. I was very active at one point, and yeah, I look back and I was like, with my young baby, and I was working, and how did it all get produced? And the point was, it wasn't sustainable.
Yeah.
It was very much reflecting this crisis situation, feeling of crisis, I think, that we all felt, and so at some point, then I slowed down, and I sort of dramatically slowed down at a point, and I really have been quite inactive recently, to be honest, just, full transparency. And I think it's just reflected as sort of a shift in my priorities at the moment. I've gained a lot of benefits from having this presence on social media, including a wide network, but now I kind of feel like, okay, I've got this network, so I've got some pretty active projects going on right now, so I just sort of shifted gears. But I like to maintain. Also, Twitter has changed a lot, so that's influenced that as well. So I find myself kind of swinging between extremes at times. I think what was particularly tough for me was when there was a period where people were like, oh, Natalie knows about this topic, and then they would tag me and everything and be like, respond, like, tell us what you think. And then at that same time, I'm getting like 6 requests from reporters a day, and I'm getting, all these things, and then I've got my job and all this stuff. And so the people pleaser in me like really struggles just, having to create that wall or saying no, or just sometimes it's not even responding because I'm so overwhelmed. And so I think that was, in terms of time management, it wasn't always like the Twitter, because I could do the tweet, and just send it out there. But it was all the stuff that would come after that would be all this requests, and like, oh, the reporter saying, oh, I see you're thinking about this topic, so I'm going to ask you about it, and I'm going to get 6 requests. And so I think then that would kind of discourage me. There was this a feedback loop. But I recognize that is so specific to the pandemic. Yeah. So yeah, I know I'm not going to tweet now, and 6 reporters are not going to like come out the woodwork to ask me what I think. But that did play into the cycle.
Great. I think maybe now we can open it up for some questions from the audience, if anybody would like to
Have any
questions.
I have a question for Natalie in particular. Did you find that your time on Twitter/X, especially at the end of the pandemic, did it help you build any very meaningful work relationships, academic relationships, and or opportunities for funding?
1,000%. Yes, absolutely. I would say that someone I met on Twitter is like one of my best friends, is Caitlin Rivers from Johns Hopkins, and she was like very active in tweeting as well, and we text every day. So like we just met through Twitter, and she brought me into this group chat that had all these like pandemic preparedness experts and pandemic law and coronavirology and modeling. And so like I'm part of this group chat still that it's like this hub of experts. So there were some benefits there. And then in terms of my professional network, I mean, a huge number of new connections to people that I just, there's a familiarity that I feel with folks now when I meet them, that is because we had this sort of parasocial, I don't know, is parasocial just in one direction?
I think it's just trauma bonding.
Trauma bonding, yeah. But like when you get to know someone's personality a bit, if they make the same jokes, like, they make certain types of jokes, like you kind of know what their interests are. And it feels like you skip 5 steps when you meet them because you've already have this history. And that has gotten me invitations to lots of, seminars, meetings, things like that. I'm sure it plays into funding. And then I also think that it has just led to some amount of recognition that is beneficial. That, when I meet someone new, sometimes there'll be some recognition that helps me. Yeah.
Please.
So now that the pandemic is over, how do you decide to select your subject?
Great question.
Yeah, because my background is in infectious disease, when there are infectious disease things that are happening, like that will really drive, especially if I start seeing DMs about the same thing, like talk about measles, or talk about, like the HPV vaccine results. Like I've talked about kind of topical things in infectious disease, and I very much, people, and Natalie may have experienced this too, but it's like once you get people's trust on a subject, they want to ask you about everything. And so I have made it like a point, people ask me about, forever microplastics in blood. And it's like, it's just not my zone in my like personal Instagram. I'll talk to our experts at Rollins, and I'll do it for Rollins stuff and repost it to my Instagram. But yeah, for me, I stick to the subject area that I am comfortable with and passionate about and understand and feel like I have the resources to talk to people about.
I'd say I'm trying to figure that out. I'm very goal oriented.
And I think I'm trying to figure out what the next stage looks like now that there's less of an immediate need for content. There was such focused need for such a period of time that but I sort of define like a set of issues that are important to me. Well, one is always going to be infectious diseases, but then the other relates to sort of issues within academia. I think I'm very interested in sort of equity within academia and support for supporting diverse populations and like parents and I don't know, all these different things that kind of come up, and so I can, that may be what. Yeah. So trying to figure out kind of what's important to me and where I think I can make an impact through social media or maybe a different platform, maybe like blogging or things like that. But I would say that I'm still figuring that out. Things have shifted.
Please.
I'm curious, in this age of like misinformation, right, how you think about the ideal accountability of like the individual creator versus these platforms in terms of fact checking and those kinds of things, right? Like when we peer review academic articles, there's a sense of accountability, and I'm curious, like, how you think about your own accountability in a, tweet that maybe you haven't spent, weeks writing, whatever, and how much accountability you see on these platforms or would like to see?
That's such a good question. And I feel like that's like the kind of big question of our time right now, right? Like I've had to issue corrections for my own stuff on Instagram, which I am happy to do because I feel like it's also part of what we're doing is educating people about, stuff related to the pandemic, also the scientific process, also like, it's fine to admit that you got something wrong and you're going to revise it now that you have better information. So for me personally, it's been fine. But yeah, I do remember like Instagram tried with their COVID-19 warning on stories. And I remember them putting it on my stories. And I was like, no, I'm right. Like, don't put this on my story. Like, what I'm saying is right. You don't need to, but they were trying, it's these automated systems are obviously flawed. But I think it is such a big deal that platforms as a whole find a way to do this. And we saw a lot of different like attempts at that. TikTok had, I think it was Team Halo, was like verified accounts that they vetted and said like, okay, the stuff these people are putting out is good. So, we're going to prioritize their content or whatever, the Instagram warnings and that kind of stuff. When Twitter went through a phase of deplatform, a ton of people that have now since been replatformed and everything. I think it's really hard because we have, free speech absolutists, but we also have an obligation to call out when people are like lying or actively deceiving people. So it is, I think, part of the job of science education to correct misinformation. And I think the real trick is going to be for us to figure out the most effective ways to do that. Like, is it to say, hey, look at this person who is full of it and like really aggressively go for it, or just to be like, I'm going to make a post about the same topic, but everything I'm going to say is right. And like, it'll just be kind of like a wink, wink that I'm talking about this thing that other people have seen. So I think that's like an ever evolving question of how we do that best.
Yeah. I feel like I probably have a less, a coherent response. But one way that I engage with that is that I would get calls from fact checkers a lot, and they would say, "Oh, well, we work with Facebook, and basically there's like 4 fact checking agencies that work with Facebook, and when something gets flagged, then they can't monetize it." And then the fact checkers come in, and then the fact checkers make some assessment. So like I was one of the experts that worked with the fact checkers, but just on specific things. So I thought that was, through my experiences, learned about some of the sort of behind the scenes, how that was working. I balanced how much I saw it as my responsibility purely to correct other people's misinformation. I feel like you could spend your whole life doing that. And I don't know what the impact would be. Certainly, there were times where I wanted to give people the language to come back for us, to reply. But it was hard, and that plays into my bandwidth earlier. But in terms of my own accountability, I had no issues correcting things. I definitely didn't want to have something up there that I felt was wrong. Like that is probably what caused me more stress than anything else. But social media is an interesting thing. I now this is a bit of a tangent, but when I peer review papers now, like if you go on medRxiv or something, you can see when people have tweeted about a paper, and sometimes I go in and I'll look if I'm assigned to that paper, and social media has done some interesting things about providing opportunities for lots of people to kind of provide input and on sort of the validity and appropriateness of preprints, because preprints became such a huge thing during the pandemic. So it's a little tangent. It's related.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yes, please.
I guess I'm wondering, you two individually decided to do and post things about scientific communication, but how do you view, since social media is growing as the platform of communication, big organizations like a CDC or something, how do you view that maybe they could utilize social media better to get more information out, or what's the appropriate way of using social media from big organizations settings?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard one, because obviously, I think for big, and this is my personal tirade, but I think for big organizations like the CDC or the NIH to be able to really use social media to disseminate information, there's going to be a lot of work to rebuild trust in large institutions. The reason I think that Natalie and I became so popular is because we are an individual, and so we feel much more accessible, and that we are someone that people could gain trust in. Whereas these big faceless organizations, I think that's why they haven't been able to successfully get that information out. I think, it is really hard, because we're also at a point, especially now, where there were people who are individual educators who partner with these organizations, then you get these accusations of oh, you're bought and paid for by the CDC or the NIH or whatever. So I think it's a thing you have to tread lightly. And I think a large portion of what needs to happen, and what the pandemic has really showed us, is that it is on these giant organizations to do the work to rebuild the trust. It's not on us to learn to trust them again, because there have been huge missteps that are really critical, and it's unfortunate. And I always try to use my platform to say I personally know so many researchers at the CDC, it's full of good scientists, but as a policy making organization, they have missed the mark in a lot of ways. And so, I think it's hard, because it would be nice if we could just be oh, let's look at the CDC Instagram and see what they say about this. But I think, the reason that these individual influencers on social media have gotten popular is because there is a lack of trust in these big organizations.
Yeah, I'd add to that another big challenge is just how quickly they can respond. And just for a big bureaucratic institution,
we're like 20 people have to sign off on everything. Like it's very hard to be nimble, and being nimble is important for these types of things. You know, yeah, I don't feel so like equipped to, because it's not my training, right? But I can comment kind of as like I see, what I think is a gap. And I think a lot of us individuals, I've had this conversation with other folks, like other scientists, is, we felt the need to be more active in part because of an absence from another institution. Yep.
Any other questions, Bess? Next.
So, as science communicators, you're communicating through both those channels are kind of condensed formats, and you're communicating directly to a general population. Has there been anything that you learned on either channel that you found, because you're getting the analytics right back, you can tell what posts you put up that are good or resonating, you're getting the comments back. Have you taken any lessons that can be translated to just talking about misinformation or outside of social media that could be helpful as a science communicator that you've learned that is particularly effective?
Yeah. Make your point real quick. Yeah. Make it right up front and draw people in with like something interesting. I think the way that I default to writing is a lot of background. Okay, here I go. Now I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. And it doesn't work. You have to like very quickly say like, this is the intriguing problem. This is the intriguing question. This is like the mystery. I think framing things like, I'm sure there's lots of people who know more about this than me, but sort of story-based or like a mystery that you pose. And so, sometimes when I teach, like trying to pose things as a question or a mystery that you need to solve. And that works well. I'd also say that like, I'm going to say for better or for worse, but honestly just for worse, is that controversial things take off like a rocket. Yeah. And I think that is an unfortunate feature because it does then reward a particular type of behavior or people who are willing to engage in a particular type of behavior that I don't think is what's best for building trust or conveying the message appropriately.
Yeah, I would say at least for like my audience, what I've experienced is people love to fight. So if there's like some sort of blatant misinformation or whatever, and you can come back with like, here are your talking points for your family at Thanksgiving about this thing, people like absolutely love it, which is, it's not like the best for like pure science education, but if you can get people talking to their families about these topics and this like complex situation and giving them talking points so they can try to explain things to people really like love that and appreciate that.
Yeah, a little snark tended to work well. They like it when you get mad. But then at a certain point, I was like, there's too many people following me that, are above me. And I should be careful. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience?
I had one more.
Yeah.
You both had such big media experiences during the pandemic, and I was curious if both or one of you could talk about one that was especially surreal.
Yeah, I have one. Well, okay, so like Natalie said, at the height of it, you're getting so many media requests, and like I got a lot of like podcast requests, and it's just me, and so I was like, I don't know if these podcasts are like good or real or whatever, and so I would say no to more than I would say yes to, and I think I was like so annoyed with the amount of requests I was getting, or just like didn't know how to handle it. That's such a request, and my brain just wasn't working. It was for Science Friday at NPR, and I did it, and I like remember I felt kind of bad afterwards because I feel like maybe I sounded short or annoyed while I was talking about this, science thing. And then a couple of weeks later, when it was coming out, I got a text message from my sister, and she was like, "Hey, are you gonna be on Science Friday?" And I was like, "Yeah." What? And she was like, "Someone I worked with heard your name on the radio and called me." And I was like, "Oh my," because they were like, "It's on NPR." And I was like, yeah, NPR on my podcast section of my phone. And then I was like, "Oh my God, wait, it's the radio?" You're on the radio. And I think that was the craziest because it was so many of my friends who listened to that podcast on their own, like reposting it and being like, "Oh my God, Laura's on Science Friday." And I was doing so much that it didn't have a second to click that I was like on one of the most popular science shows on NPR, and then I was really embarrassed that I wasn't more charged.
Well,
related directly to that is that I also was on Science Friday at one point, and before you get an invitation and then you talk to the producer, and I said, okay, so what is Science Friday? Can you explain to me what the audience is? So, but I think one of the most surreal experiences for me was there was a period very early on in the pandemic where I was on like BBC World News Radio weekly on this sort of Q&A thing with these Ask the Experts type thing, or a few of us. And at one point, I'm on live radio, okay? I start getting loud, I'm at my house, loud banging on the front door. And it was the mailman trying to get a signature for a package. And I kept trying to be like, no, because it just was like, I was trying to answer these questions, so this loud banging. And finally I was able to scribble this note like, I'm on live radio, and I show it to the guy. He was very sweet. But it was like this sort of weird, I'm at home, but I'm on the radio. Because I think, I would take these interviews, but I would be in my house. So it kind of it didn't feel like I had the exposure I did because I wasn't, at the studio, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I sat on the floor of my closet to do my radio lab, interview. It's just very weird. Yeah.
One last question.
I'll make the last one.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make it good. One thing that I've been thinking of is just the subject matter. I'm also a health sciences communicator and work with a lot of subject matter experts who have their own personal, Twitter, Instagram, huge followings, and sort of part of that is, having personality, having opinions, but then there's always kind of the clear and, hard line of like, they're not speaking on behalf of, the institution. But then at the same time, I think that, there's value in sort of working with and cultivating those voices, especially if we're pitching those experts, to media. So what is your advice, or just, do you have thoughts on sort of how to, I guess, walk that line of like, yes, we're not speaking on behalf of Emory, but also we are, a huge asset to Emory, and that we have this voice that people are listening to, and how can we as communicators, I guess, encourage the good part of that, and then also kind of be a resource for when shit might hit the fan, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a very specific question to me. When I started doing it, I tried to do it the right way and run everything through the School of Medicine's comms department, and they were like, please don't talk to anyone. Which, like, I can't blame them for. Like, they didn't know me. Like, of course, and they're getting so many media requests. Like, of course they're going to be like, please don't do this. I was very lucky that my boss at the time was like, Laurel can do this. Please let her do this. So what I did is I switched to just not mentioning Emory, which was weird, right? Because my credibility comes from my work with Emory. But eventually I started doing it, and then Emory started sending me media requests because they saw that I could do it. So I think, one of the things with some of these jobs is you have to prove that you can do it before anyone's going to let you do it. And of course, now I've been hired by the School of Public Health to do their science communication because of this work. So yeah, I think it's a fine line, and like I don't fault the School of Medicine at all for being like, please don't take any media requests. Like we don't, because they're overwhelmed, and who am I, right? But I think it was instrumental in me to have support from my boss to vouch for me and to trust me. So I think those reciprocal relationships can be really beneficial if you can approach them in the right way and get buy-in from people. But also, this is work that we can and should be allowed to do on our own. And Emory has always been very supportive of me doing stuff on my own personal account, which has been great. So yeah, I think it's a thing to toe the line, but I think once you find the person who is reciprocal, that's helpful. Obviously, I'm more cognizant. Like I don't have the fight in me like I did at the beginning of the pandemic, where I was like actively trying to get out fights, which is a big thing, and it's Emory's probably grateful for too, because it makes everybody's life easier. But yeah, learning those skills about how to navigate things gracefully so that it doesn't even matter if people know that I work for Emory or not, because none of what I'm saying is going to be, used as a weapon for my employer.
I never asked permission for anything. So I don't know. I mean, and I'm not, but what is that?
As every faculty member would say.
Yeah, I'm not faculty, so I have to say a little more.
I guess my response as sort of the end of it, the sort of the personality end, right? Like, I think just
for me is just being able to demonstrate what the value add to the institution, and where I can demonstrate that it's led to X, Y, and Z, and that it, that it is sort of mutually beneficial. But honestly, everyone's been very supportive, so haven't had too many of those discussions.
Great. Well, thank you both, Laurel and Natalie, for taking the time here to talk to us, to answer some of these questions, and teach us a lot. So, and thanks for everybody for coming out this afternoon. Thank you, Joyce, and what's next?